Historic Landmark Commission. My name is Carlton Getz, Vice Chair of the Commission. Chair Iwanowski was not able to join us today, so I will be leading the meeting for this evening. I will call the meeting to order. We have Commissioners Abramson, Kearns, Barnett, Getz, and DeLay present, so we have established a quorum at the meeting. As a reminder, we have one item on the agenda tonight that involves a public hearing, and for those who may not have joined us before, the public hearing process goes according to a certain schedule. The staff will present, the applicant may present thereafter. We will have a public comment session after that, and then we will go into executive session, at which point the Commission discusses amongst themselves the item and we proceed to a vote. If you do want to comment during the public session, we do have comment cards that are available right outside the room that you can drop off with staff, or we will also call and see if there's anyone that wants to make a public comment when the time comes. That said, moving on, we have minutes from the prior meeting subject to approval. Does anyone have a motion to amend or approve the minutes from the prior meeting?
I move to accept the minutes.
Okay. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. And we will proceed to a vote. Commissioner DeLay? Aye. Commissioner Kearns?
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett?
Aye.
Commissioner Abramson?
I abstain. I wasn't here.
All right. I vote aye. So we will adopt the minutes. All right. Report of the chair and vice chair. Obviously, the chair is not here. I only have one comment. Commissioner Mike Vella, who's been with the Landmark Commission for some time, has moved on to the Planning Commission. I just want to note that while we will miss his input on various items and his insights, we wish him the well in his new endeavors with the Planning Commission. Report of the director. Do we have a report?
I have a couple things to report. One was Michael Vella moving to the Planning Commission. Good for him. And we have started a recruitment campaign for more commissioners from several districts. I wanted to comment on some publicity that any members from the commission have seen about the Downtown Alliance and the city exploring an MOU for permanent public market buildings at Pioneer Park that were unveiled a couple weeks ago. I just wanted to let the commission know that, of course, any new construction proposed by the city or another entity would come before the Historic Landmark Commission if there were any questions about that, but we're excited about the possibility of permanent public buildings. Any questions about that? Okay, great. And because we didn't have our meeting last month, I just wanted the commission to know that we do have an application in for a landmark status, the Sampson Altadena property, and that will come to the Landmark Commission. I think it's a complete application at this point. I haven't been able to check.
Can you talk into the microphone? I can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
No.
Thank you. Is that better? Okay. Just please shout out if you can't hear me. I appreciate that. Do you want me to repeat that? Repeat what I've said? Okay. You may have seen some publicity in the last couple weeks concerning the city and the Downtown Alliance working together with public-private partnerships to perhaps erect permanent structures in Pioneer Park to host the public market year-round and a lot of other programming for Pioneer Park. I just wanted to say, congrats to everyone who's been working on this effort, but just to let everyone know that new construction will come before the Historic Landmark Commission. I had a couple questions from the public about that. Any questions there? Yeah. Yes, and the Altadena property, Sampson Altadena, it's 2 buildings. They have applied, their HOA has applied for landmark status. And we've taken that application in, and it will be put, I'm not sure entirely which agenda, either next month or the next month for your review for landmark status. Great, thank you. And tonight, I know it's on your agenda, but I just wanted to welcome Jansen from SHPO, who will be doing a training for us this evening. So thank you, that's all I have.
Thank you. We will open the meeting now to public comments that are not related to any items on the agenda. Does anyone have someone? Please step up, and if you would, state your name for the record.
Is this on? Okay. Thank you for having me, Commissioners. I'm Councilmember Ava Lopez Chavez, proudly representing District 4. Those boundaries are 800 South to South Temple to 800 South, 4th West University Street. It is home to over 240 structures that are contributing to Salt Lake City today that are not protected under our local designation process. So I'm here today because a lot of our residents are feeling the whiplash of upzoning, and as you know, we're going through our zoning consolidation in the near future. I take very seriously the role both as a council member but also as a resident to representing the neighborhoods in District 4. There's lots of opportunities to actually work with planning and with our transportation departments to facilitate the reuse, the adaptive reuse of these buildings. Otherwise, you and I know that private property rights precede any code, and such can promote demolitions that are absolutely obstructing the history and preservation of our city. So I'm here to formally introduce myself. This is long overdue, and that is my apologies for being so busy. You see me in athletic clothes, and that's because I literally ran here. I'm gonna run back to the gym and then take a meeting after. But I just want to thank you for your work. There are quite a few residents here today. Our Deputy Director, Michaela Octay, mentioned the the Altadena Sampson project has applied for local designation, and I'm very eager to support that, as well as consider other potential protections in place of that building, as well as other applications that you'll hear today in regard to the movement of buildings. That is something that I'm seeing particularly useful as we look to isolate some of these buildings are impeding development projects, specifically in the downtown. And I think we need to come up with a better system or process, policies that can help us integrate the movement and mobility of adapting these buildings in a proper historic district so that they can be protected for the lifespan of Salt Lake City and outlive each and every one of us. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your service. And it is such an honor to be your representative here today.
Thank you for joining us.
Could you please repeat your name for me?
Right there, Ava Lopez Chavez.
You don't have to stay for the rest of the Sorry? You don't have to stay for the rest of the
Oh, I know, I was just gonna stay on for 10 minutes and then jump to the gym.
Thank you. Are there any other comments for general comments? All right, seeing none, we will close general public comments and move into our first agenda item for the evening. That's the relocation of a contributing structure at approximately 632 South, 700 East. Case number PLNHLC 2025-00330. On behalf of staff, Noah Elmore will be presenting.
Thank you for the introduction, and good evening. This is a request for relocation of the contributing structure located at 632 South, 700 East to approximately 635 East, 700 South. This proposal also includes a request for a modification of the required 10-foot side yard setback to be reduced by 4 feet 6 inches for a setback of 5 feet 6 inches along the east side lot line. Staff is recommending that the Historic Landmark Commission approve these requests. The subject property is located on the west side of 700 between 600 South and 700 South, highlighted here in red. The site is also located approximately half a block to the south of Trolley Square, a significant local landmark site you may have heard of. The new location, 635 East, 700 South, is located within the same block just around the corner, highlighted here in yellow. Aside from also being located within the same block, the new location, which is currently vacant, similarly lies within the Central City Local Historic District and is also zoned RMF 30. The subject building was originally built in 1915 in the arts and crafts style. Building materials and character-defining features include a brick foundation, brick piers with wood columns on the porch in the craftsman style, wood drop or novelty siding, wood shingle siding in that front porch gable you can see there, exposed wood rafters, and an asphalt shingle roof. The proposal includes a new foundation, walls, roof, while retaining the existing character-defining features. The applicant is requesting a reduction of the east side yard setback from the required 10-foot side yard setback for a reduction of 4 feet 6 inches, so the east side lot line would see a setback of 5 feet 6 inches. The proposed modification would allow the reconstructed building to match its historic setbacks, as the existing and proposed lots are both 33 feet wide. Matching the historic setbacks will then allow the building to more appropriately fit within the context of the block and the neighborhood. Strict adherence to the current standards would ignore the historic development pattern in the central city and prevent the building from being located to its new location. Staff is recommending the Historic Landmark Commission approve the relocation request with the condition listed in the staff report. And that's all I have.
Okay, does the commission have any questions for Noah?
Is there anything from this building that will be retained?
I believe
That's
so it's going to be deconstructed and then reconstructed. So I'll allow the applicant to speak more on that if they would like, but my understanding is it's going to be deconstructed so the historic materials can be retained and then rebuilt at the new location. So as I mentioned, it's going to feature new things like walls and foundation. That means those things will be replaced, whereas those exterior character defining features will be retained and protected.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. The applicant may present before the commission. Is there anyone presenting on behalf of the applicant on this item? All right. And as a reminder, you have 10 minutes. For the presentation on your part, and if you would, state names for the record, and also, as Commissioner DeLay reminded us earlier, the microphones are sensitive, and please speak into them so that we can keep it on the public record.
My name's Dustin Glazier, and I'm with the architectural team that did the pre-design.
Doug White, attorney with S.K. Hart and Charlie.
Can you
I'm
please
not sure
turn
that
that
your
microphone
microphone
on
was
and read
on.
your name?
Here, there we go. All right. Doug White, attorney with Trolley Square.
Brett Simpson, project manager with Trolley Square.
Yeah, thank you. Please.
So currently the game plan is to, if you've been in that area and seen that house, from a distance, it looks pretty awesome. and it has some really cool features, but the problem is over time it's deteriorated, especially a lot of the cool features about the house. And so there's actually a lot of like dry rot and things like that where the paint makes it look cool, but you push on it and it just caves in. And so our intent is to thoroughly measure the entire house and replicate it with the new modern products that will look identical. And then that way we can preserve the history of the look with modern materials that will actually last. Like Noah said, it has a brick foundation, and so moving it in one giant piece is basically impossible. And in older houses, there's pretty much zero structural in them, and so they fall apart really easily when trying to move it in one piece, especially with the condition it's in right now. And so our intent is to replicate it with the best we can with all the modern products, and then we'd have a product that can last for 50 years instead of just buying time where it is right now.
Like hardy board?
No, it would be exactly the same thing.
Oh.
So we'd have to have custom siding made, and then we found classic retailers for the trim, and so we can pretty much match all of the molding, all of the detailing, all of that. We found a retailer on the East Coast that sells that.
Great. I guess the biggest question I would have is, why are we moving it? Because you're developing that block?
Yeah, the intent is to use that space for future development, and this whole move would not happen unless that larger development was approved.
And will this be used as a home?
Yes. Yes, it will be actually a duplex, so we'll be doing a basement with a full basement apartment.
We need housing.
Can I ask?
Duplex now, though, is it?
Can we continue to allow them to do their presentation
Oh,
and
yeah.
reserve
Oh, I thought he
questions
was
for
done.
later?
Sorry.
No.
Yeah, please, if you have items to present, feel free to proceed. We got a little distrayed into questions there a bit early.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, if approved,
If you
we
could
would
speak a
use-
little closer to the microphone. Thank you.
If approved, we would use this space for the larger development that is planned for Trolley Square. If that plan is not approved, the house will not be moved. We've looked at this house for some years. We purchased it 4 years ago in anticipation of that. Actually, it was rented out before then, which I believe was it should have been probably at most a duplex renting, but they had 4 or 5 different tenants in there, as you would find out through that area. So we've actually done some repairs on the inside and keep it up, but we think that we are in a position now to be a little bit more bold, and we're moving forward with our design plans, which we hope to have a DRT meeting on that within the next couple of weeks. I personally looked around for probably a year attempting to actually pick this house up. And much to my surprise, the only person that was willing to do it before had changed his mind. Val Gardson out of Utah County. Some of you may be familiar with him. I checked. No one in Utah I could find. If you know of someone, please let me know. I've checked in Idaho. I went so far as to check with a group in Pennsylvania, some Amish folks that move houses. And the cost is just beyond, it's not possible. And so if we can use the components of the house, those are going over. will be of sorts refurbished, put on. But what Dustin did say, there's a way that you can take digital pictures of the house. You probably all know this, and then duplicate it. You'll have every turn and every bind and every window and that's what we're trying to do. As I say, the person's lot that we're putting this on is Wendy Mendenhall. She's right back here. She's a longtime person in that area and has worked with us very diligently over the years, had a lot of patience. And we're hoping that with this design and the plan in mind that this will be a great part of what we're trying to do over there.
Okay, anything else you want to add?
I'm here, my role is a project manager, so once things are approved, that's when I get going on them. So I'm here to observe and meet all of you as we have other projects that will be coming before the commission, and just to get a feel for it. So
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
All right, with that, does anyone on the commission have questions for the applicants?
I have one. What's the history of the new site? Is it a subdivision of a larger site? Was there a house there originally that's been demolished? What was there?
You know, and maybe we have Wendy answer that. There is no house there now. We never took one down. It's been vacant for, Wendy?
I'm sorry, if you're going to contribute, could you come up to the front and so it's on the public record as well?
Sorry about that.
No.
I was going to say I can speak to the history of the site a little bit. I did research it when I reviewed the modification for the setback to see just how appropriate or inappropriate it would be. And looking at old Sanborn maps, there was a home there in the past. I don't know what happened to that home, but it's no longer there now. You can drive by and it's vacant. But yeah, I researched that there was a home there. So when we're looking at we can take this new home, put it at this new location. That'll help replicate what was there previously in terms of the neighborhood historic character for buildings.
Okay.
Go ahead, tell them.
I'm Wendy Mendenhall. I own that property. There we go.
There we go.
Wendy Mendenhall, I own that property. I've known that property for about 20 years. There's been no home there. So good information. I have no idea what happened to it. There's no sign or any history from the neighbors that I've talked to either that they had any indication there was a home there. So
Yeah, I assume the Sanborn map's probably from 1910-ish, 1920, so it's been quite some time.
Yeah.
Potentially. Okay.
It may have even been gone by 1950. I can't quite recall, but yeah.
Okay.
So I'm trying to get my mind around this. This says it's a proposed move and relocation, but what I heard two messages. I heard one that it's just being replicated. The building is being replicated. Then I also heard that parts of it are going to be salvaged and put on the new building. So
Correct. Both of those are right.
So how much of this building on this vacant lot would be historic material? What percentage of the building would be historic material?
Basically anything that's salvageable that can be refurbished will be reused, but things that are deteriorated beyond use will be replaced.
The structure, or is that just exterior materials?
It would be basically anything exterior visually, but structurally, structurally, basically everything will be replaced with new products.
All new structure.
Yes.
We thought that once we moved it.
Is your mic on?
Sorry.
Just keep it on.
We'd have to upgrade all the electrical, all of that kind of stuff. It was better to the final product to make all that stuff brand new inside and leave the exterior as you hopefully see it today.
One of my sticking points with regard to that, with regard to sort of salvaging or replacing, is the windows. We talk a lot about windows here, it seems like. And I'm wondering whether any of the existing windows on the house are or seem to be original. And if there aren't any, or in the case where things have been replaced, what's the plan for the appearance of new windows?
I can speak on that. So windows can be reviewed as a separate minor alteration, so they're a little bit outside the scope of work of the petition tonight.
Any other questions at this time?
Sorry, can I get a clarification on that? So we're not allowed to concern ourselves with windows when we're deciding whether this house should be moved or not? I'm confused by that.
Yeah, I'm curious, does that mean it's going to come back for review again?
No, so this is analysis of standards for relocation as opposed to something like new construction or windows. So we're looking at, are we retaining the character defining features such as the columns, the gable end? You'll notice I didn't mention windows. Those are not included as one of the character defining features. So that's just not quite within the scope of work of this specific petition. And when you look at the standards for relocation, it's outside this scope. So if they want to work on those, we can review those under a separate minor alteration application at a future date.
The list of character defining features and windows not being on it, I guess, is the clarification that I needed. So thank you.
Can I respond to that further? If the windows and things like that, if we can't or don't use them, we intend to save them. And if somebody can make use of them, and we are aware of several companies or individuals, we are going to work with that. That's been discussed at length.
I'm curious, and this is more for the staff and for this group, but I'm wondering why this comes as a relocation, because this does not sound like a relocation to me. I feel like there's sort of a switch and bait here. Like, I came here expecting that a building was going to be relocated, and I'm now hearing what sounds to me like it should be like this is an application for a new building with some historical details on it.
So there was a similar petition in 2017 for the Hawk Cabin on 3rd West that was similarly disassembled and reassembled, akin to what this petition will be. So it's been reviewed by Historic Landmark Commission in the past.
Does not seem like anything close to the same thing. I know the Hawk Cabin, it's logs, and you disassemble them. You're disassembling the structure and everything. Here, it's going to be a new building with exterior decoration. It's historic materials. It's all new construction. So I'm confused why I'm being asked to judge a relocation on a building that's not being relocated. It's just pieces of a building are being taken and put on a new building. That's the reality of it. So I don't know how to judge. I don't know how to judge this in the context of a relocation when it's just pieces are being taken and put on a new structure.
So I think it's important to keep in mind that we're looking at the exterior of the building. We don't regulate the interior. So, today it's a contributing structure. They could demo interior walls. They could replace the electrical, and we wouldn't even be discussing that here tonight. So I think when we look at preservation of the exterior, that's the main focus of this application, this petition, this process.
Yeah, and if the application were for moving, like you said, you've looked into, and if it was being lifted up and moved and being gutted, and all the plumbing and heating and all that was being redone on the inside, that'd be like, well, this is still the same building. It's gutted on the inside, but this does not sound to me like it's the same building.
So they're disassembling the exterior features and going to retain as much in terms of what's salvageable. So disassembling the exterior features and reassembling them at a new location, if it's the same elements, it's just been disassembled and reassembled. It's still being relocated to a new site.
I realize it's semantics, but it is like what is a building if you take all the structure out of it and you just put the deck, the skin on the outside? Is the skin a building? It doesn't seem to me like that. It seems to me like it crosses.
Well, if I could respond, I think that it's not the skin that's being recreated; it is the character-defining features that are being disassembled and moved. And that's the way that I interpret it. That it's the character of the house that will be. That makes sense. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
The character-defining features are what's being moved, and less the physical material that's being moved.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Which is a helpful perspective. I'm still like very, I'm still sort of hung up on like historic fabric.
If they said that, it would go over a little smoother.
Let's save that for the executive session, because I think we're bordering a bit. Do you have anything else to add as the applicant?
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. With that, we will open the session to public hearing for any members of the public that'd like to comment on this item. I do have one card from Miss Cindy Cromer.
Well, like some of you, this is not what I was expecting. I was thinking we were talking about the relocation of an historic structure, and I don't think that's what we're talking about, and we're talking about some unknown amount of reusing historic materials and some unknown amount of new materials milled to look like the original materials. It's very different than what I thought we were looking at. So that's the reason I keep showing up at these meetings. So in terms of what I saw, I was especially concerned about not seeing the tax photographs or the reconnaissance level inventory photographs of the street-facing facades, because that window is not appropriate to any period of the house. And I'm concerned that the architects have reproduced it on the north and south facades, where I think it's completely inappropriate. I think my message to you at this point, and I started out with really chatty comments about moving houses and how we do it south. You just chop down a bunch of pine trees and you put them on the ground and you roll the house. That's how you do it. But I think at this point, I would urge you to not allow this to proceed at the staff level. I think there are so many unknowns here, that decisions that would be made on the ground, that it is appropriate to revisit this in a public process, even if I'm the only person that shows up, because there are just too many decisions that are going to be made on the fly. I am fully supportive of relocating this house. It's just, that's not what I just heard. I heard about a reconstruction, and I heard about some unknown amount of reuse of historic materials, and it's that unknown that I'm not comfortable with. I'm fine with moving the house from the state highway around the corner to a much better streetscape. It's just that there's too many decisions that are going to be made on the ground while this is happening. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public that would like to make a comment on this item? All right, seeing none, as the applicant, you have an opportunity to respond to any of the public comments that have been made, if you so choose.
No, I think we've said what we need to say. Thank you for your time.
All right, with that, we will close the public session and move into executive session, where the commission will discuss the issue amongst itself. Who would like to kick us off?
As a window and door person, I don't find that their drawings are consistent. Their openings are not, there's a door on the west side here and a transom that doesn't translate into the new drawings. And I do see that this kind of, detail here and a detail there, and what's available and what isn't available is going to be just a long list of compromises and half-truths, and that is concerning to me.
I mean, I guess that's the sense I have. I have the same sense of like when you're trying to recreate this whole thing, how true does it end up being to the historic building? I went by the building and looked at it. I was wondering about that arched window up top. I'm like, well, clearly it's not original. Even the opening is not original. And I'm like, okay, but the drawings that I'm seeing here show it recreated just the way it is now. And I'm like, okay, well, that seems to me, if we're going to the trouble to sort of recreate this historic exterior, then it ought to at least be accurate. And how do we know that that's going to happen? And that kind of goes to, I think, what Cindy was saying. It's like there's so many little decisions in a thing like that. And it's different than if the house were all being moved and then repairs were being done to deteriorated materials, patching in siding or, in place. But when you're peeling everything off and then putting it back on, how do you be sure that all those details get right? And it's I think that's beyond tricky. So.
But the code doesn't require us to do that, right? Like, even if you were repairing a front balustrade or something and you had an inappropriate window such as this one changed out, the code does not require us to take a look at the building at some alterations that were inappropriately put in at one time and have you fix that too, necessarily. So the relocation process also doesn't have such a strict threshold to it such as we should require the applicant to bring the building back to every historic detail as when it was built. I think that's
well, so that
not,
begs
it's
the
not
question.
required.
So they could just take the aluminum frame window or vinyl window that's in the gable now and just put that back in the building, and that would be okay with us, even though that doesn't meet the design standards.
They could.
That's partly what confuses me about we're calling this a relocation. So like the standards that we would normally apply don't apply. Whereas
there are different standards to this process. The reasoning that the applicants are bringing it and entering into this process is because for years they've been trying to redevelop that south parking lot. And we've been advising them on which buildings absolutely cannot be demolished because of their contributory status, and that this is an available process to them. They have jumped on this process for years trying to figure out a way to move it. There aren't any movers, that is true. And some reconstruction as the way that they have planned it and proposed to you all, maybe not in as complete detail, will be reviewed by our staff. It has been done in Park City. It's certainly a way that a building can be relocated and I guess reskinned or reconstructed. If they do hit an issue with like that window and wanted to change it out, yes, we would take a look at what they proposed to some historic photos to find something that perhaps is more appropriate than what's there, but it meets the threshold for a contributory building right now and can be relocated under this process. Does that make sense?
Insofar as the code statute that deals with relocations is involved, unfortunately, I don't have internet access right now, so I can't pull it up to review that. But could you just review what constitutes a relocation under the statute?
Yeah, and Noah, I don't know if you have a slide.
A little closer, please.
Noah, do you have a slide with the standards for relocation while I pull them up?
I don't have a slide, but I can double check this. I don't believe we, strictly speaking, define relocation in Salt Lake City Code. So when we,
Sorry.
no, go ahead.
Do you want me to read the standards?
You need to speak into the thing. We can't.
I'm trying.
There you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was
I
referring.
think it's the glasses with the thing. Okay.
The glasses, it's a thing.
Okay. In considering an application for a certificate of appropriateness for relocation of a landmark site or a contributing structure, the Historic Landmark Commission shall find that the project substantially complies with the following standard. The first standard is the proposed relocation will abate demolition of the structure. The second standard is the proposed relocation will not diminish the overall physical integrity of the district or diminish the historical associations used to define the boundaries of the district. Number 3, the proposed relocation will not diminish the historical or architectural significance of the structure. 4, the proposed relocation will not have a detrimental effect on the structural soundness of the building or structure. 5, a professional building mover will move the building and protect it while it's being stored. And 6, and the final, a financial guarantee will ensure the rehabilitation of the structure once the relocation has occurred and is provided to the city. The financial guarantee shall be in the form approved by the city attorney in an amount determined by the planning director sufficient to cover the estimated cost to rehabilitate the structure as approved by the Historic Landmark Commission and restore the grade and landscape of the property from which the structure was removed in the event that the land is left to be vacant once the relocation of the structure occurs.
Yeah, so that is reflected in the staff report. I was actually curious if the code section or the statute, I assume it's the city administrative code, but refers earlier in the staff report to section 21A point something or other. I'd have to look it up again. And does that define what a relocation is?
No, the word relocation is not defined in chapter 21A.62. So we don't have a word we can point out and say, this specific proposal reviewing does or does not meet this definition in Salt Lake City Code.
All right. Okay.
Of course, I'm troubled still. Because I hear what you just said, and it talks about a structure. And if I took this to the Supreme Court, they would look at that and they would say, even though I understood what you're saying, well, we're trying to move the character defining features, and the Supreme Court would say that is not what the law says. The law does not say character defining, it says a structure. And moving the siding and the brackets and the columns and the whatever, that's not a structure. So legal, like from a legal standpoint, it's like that's clearly was not the intent of the design guidelines that it would apply. They never had this scenario in mind, which is what throws us into a quandary, because it doesn't really give us good guidelines for a situation like this. And I understand what we're trying to do is find a way to preserve this contributing structure that has architectural value in the district. Mm-hmm. And is this a reasonable way to do it? I mean, is this?
I understand what you're saying, and I've consulted with our senior attorneys that it is a structure. Yes, the code is not saying a deconstructed structure that will be reconstructed, but regardless, they're moving a structure that they would like to reconstruct on another site and relocate that.
I think I would also look at the first standard. The proposed relocation will abate the demolition of the structure. So when you look at this project in the proposal, it's going to result in a building that is in better condition than it is in today. So if we're looking at the long-term health of the historic district, right now there's a vacant site, there's nothing there, and this will result in a contributing structure at that location, whereas currently you'd alternatively be looking at a new construction which would result in a non-contributing building, and potentially down the road the loss of a contributing building. Whereas here we have the opportunity to preserve a contributing structure in the district, in the same block even, right around the corner.
That doesn't look like a scary concrete brutalist box. I think they've researched this, and it is to our code. So I'm having trouble with you two having trouble with what's written, because this is the rules, and we're here to enforce
Well,
those.
it's not a matter, it's a matter of opinion, not individual. I do have some, I will, Alan, to your degree, I mean, to the extent that the standard says proposed relocation will abate demolition of the structure, to the extent that the building is being reconstructed, we're not abating demolition of anything. The proposed relocation will not diminish the historic and architectural significance of the structure. To the extent that things are being recreated, it will diminish the architectural significance of the structure. The proposed relocation will not have a detrimental effect on the structural soundness of the building or structure. If we're rebuilding the structure, then it's going to have a detrimental impact on the existing structure. So looking at the standards that we have, I'm not entirely convinced, based on the fact that this seems to be more of a reconstruction than a relocation, that this actually meets those standards.
I think the word is rebuilding, because they're not moving it. They're making basically another one of this contributing structure. And I think that they preserve the fabric of the neighborhood and the community by doing this. And, I think there's a lot of people who would like to see this project move forward. But rebuilding isn't really a word, and I can say that because every time I type my own business name, it spell checks it. And so, but rebuilding is what's happening here. And I like the plan. I feel like this lot is a liability to the area, and by improving the density of this particular part of the block, it opens up a lot of opportunities. But it does have a erroneous kind of taste to it. But I like the plan, and I wish them success.
I'm finding myself coming back to standard 2, which I think is perhaps the crucial one for this particular case, which says that the proposed relocation will not diminish the overall physical integrity of the district. I think to the point that was just made, it will actually improve the physical integrity of the district along the south face of this block by recreating the original level of density along that street front, which I'm leaning towards that being more important than the studs and the bricks forming the structure in its current location.
Does the commission have any other comments or discussion? Can I entertain a motion?
I'm happy to make a motion. Based on the information presented in discussion, I move that the commission approve this relocation application as recommended by staff.
Second.
Seconded by Commissioner Kearns. All right, Commissioner DeLay.
Aye.
Commissioner Kearns.
Aye.
Commissioner Barnett.
No.
Commissioner Abramson.
Aye.
And I will vote aye as well. The motion passes. All right,
Thank you.
That was the only item on our formal agenda today. Let's see here. With that, I would like to thank everyone for attending, and we will move on. We will close the formal meeting and move on to the training session. Is that
Can we take a few-minute break so that I can get his computer set up?
Yes, absolutely. We'll take a 5-minute break. We will proceed into the training session. I'd like to welcome, forgive me if I butcher this, is it Jansen Burnett? Bennett. It's highlighted, so it's really hard to tell. Jason Bennett from the State Historic Preservation Office. Please proceed.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me.
It's not on the public light particularly, but
I will try hard. I am not used to sitting at a microphone, so I will do my best.
Why don't you move the microphone up just a little bit so it's more directly, yeah, there
Okay.
you go.
So we can make this as tricky as was said, my name is Jansen Bennett. I'm the preservation architect on staff with the Utah State Historic Preservation Office. Michaela asked me to come and provide a training on the Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. So with that, I will dive in. So the Secretary of the Interior standards are the kind of preservation best practices throughout the nation. They apply only within the United States. There are some international standards that each nation can also have their individual standards, but these are the ones used within the United States. I will begin with a brief kind of history of the standards, and then we'll dive into a few different, there are 4 sets of standards that I'll briefly mention, and then I'll dive very hard into the standards for rehabilitation, which are the ones that I see applied most frequently. And if at any time you have a question, please feel free to stop me and I will address it.
Thank you.
So, diving into the historical context, in 1966, Congress passed the National Historic Preservation Act, and that really formalizes the historic preservation movement within the United States. It also sets up a whole bunch of financial incentives, as well as the National Register of Historic Places. And with financial incentives being applied to historic buildings, there needed to be some set of policy or standards in place to determine whether a project on a historic building should or should not receive those federal incentives. And so in 1973, the Historic Preservation Grants and Aid Policies and Procedures was established. And then we have a whole iteration of those same standards. Another one in 1976, in 1979. And then we get the thing that is most similar to the current standards in 1979, and then it's updated in 1983, 85, 90, 92, 95, 2011, and finally in 2017, we have the current publication, which is the Secretary of the Interior Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties with Guidelines for Preserving, Rehabilitating, Restoring, and Reconstructing Historic Buildings. You can say that 10 times fast. So within that publication, there are 4 sets of standards for the treatment of historic properties. Preservation, which seeks to sustain the existing form, integrity, and materials of an historic property. This is often seen as a stabilization effort. So you aren't changing anything. You often aren't even repairing anything. You are preserving what is there in its current condition to the greatest extent possible. Second is rehabilitation, which makes possible compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving its historical, cultural, or architectural values. So this is the standard that is used most frequently. It allows for a building to change while still preserving all of the historic character-defining features of a property. Next is restoration, which seeks to accurately depict a property as it appeared at a particular period of time by means of the removal of features from other periods in its history and reconstruction of missing features from the restoration period. So one of the key things that delineates a restoration versus a rehabilitation is that it seeks to rebuild or restore a property to a condition at a specific point in time. This is usually referred to as a period of significance. With a restoration, it's typically the period of greatest significance. And so you pinpoint a date and then to the greatest extent possible, make that building look exactly the way it did at that time. So that includes removing any, even if they look nice, any features that have since been added, even if they're hundreds of years old. If they weren't there at the period of significance, you remove it and then restore it to the way it did previously. It's really hard to do a restoration project, largely because you need to seek documentation of what the building looked like exactly the way it did previously. Reconstruction is the fourth, and it seeks to accurately depict by means of new construction a non-surviving property for the purpose of replicating its appearance at a specific period of time and in its historic location. So reconstruction is a restoration of a building that no longer exists. So again, you need to have a specific period of significance. You need to have a sufficient amount of documentation as to what that looked like at that time. So it's relatively difficult. Again, the set of standards that are most widely applied are the standards for rehabilitation. And so I will dive into them. There are 10 of them, and so bear with me. Before I dive into those, I do want to note that there is a world of projects that meet the standards. There's also a world of projects that are well-designed or that meet a set of other standards, including international standards. And ideally, it's both. It's not always both. So there are projects that look amazing that do not meet the standards. There are projects that meet the standards that do not look amazing. So keep that in mind. Also, I've enlisted some help of Ron Swanson as a quick, this meets the standards, this does not. So this is what you'll see if this meets the standards, and this is what you'll see if one of my case studies does not meet the standards. So diving into the first standard, a property will be used as it was historically or be given a new use that requires minimal change to its distinctive materials, features, spaces, and spatial relationships. Really, we want to have a good match between a new use or continued use and the building as it was built for a historic use. For example, what you see on the left is an ice house in New England, and a developer proposed taking that ice house and converting it to multifamily housing. To do so, they would need to remove large portions of the masonry walls, and because those are one of the key character-defining features, it does not meet the standards. Even though it's a good use, removing those very clear walls that are essential to the historic use, it does not meet those standards. This is another project. This is a jail. And the proposed use was, again, for multifamily housing. But you can see in the plan on the left, the interior structure is poured concrete cell blocks. And they proposed removing that completely. Logistically, I'm not sure how that would happen, but removing it completely and then replacing all of those interior concrete walls with new frame construction. Again, because the character of the historic building would need to be completely erased in order for the new use, this is not a good match of historic use with new use. This is an 18th century church in England, and it's beautiful. And the proposed project places a bookstore within it. And you can see in the plan that all of the character, the kind of very large structure with the open spaces was conserved in this project. The big thing that they did was construct this. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but they constructed a secondary structure within the church to allow for the storage and display of books. In order to do so, they had to thicken this slab a bit and then also install some very big footings in order to support that structure. But the interior character of the space remains intact. And it's really a pretty phenomenal space. And this meets that standard. Even though it's a completely different use, it still retains all of the character of the historic building. Moving on to standard 2, the historic character of a property will be retained and preserved. The removal of distinctive materials or alteration of features, spaces, and spatial relationships that characterize a property will be avoided. In other words, once you've changed things, there's really no going back. You want to keep as much of the historic character and materials as possible. So this is on the left. It's a commercial building located on a kind of a main street or commercial district. And the proposed project removed the storefront and replaced it with a masonry wall that matches that of the second story and mimics many of the kind of character-defining features of the second story. However, because it removes the features of the building that make it most apparently commercial, it does not meet the standards. It removes the historic character of the building being a commercial space. This is another example. So here the historic buildings remain largely intact. However, they did install a rooftop garden that never existed historically. And because the garden never existed historically and was not in character at the time of its construction, it also does not meet the standards. This is another rooftop garden that was installed on a building of about the same age and style. However, they kept lower plantings around the edges and the larger plantings, the trees, toward the interior of the building. And so they are not visible from the exterior, and therefore this does meet the standard in keeping the character of the building. Moving on to standard 3. So each property will be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or elements from other historic properties, will not be undertaken. In other words, don't lie about the history of the building. So here is another similar example where they had the commercial building that they proposed moving over to what's shown on the right with a smaller entrance, as well as 2 window openings as opposed to the large kind of commercial storefront. So we already know that this doesn't meet standard 2 because it's changing the apparent character of the building from commercial to residential. But because it mimics the detailing of the historic building to such a great extent, it blurs the line of what is historic and what is not, or what appears to be historic and what is not. And therefore, it does not meet the standard. This project looked at constructing 2 floors of this historic building that were designed but never built. And so they had the floor plans that, for one reason or another, my guess is probably financial, were never constructed. And they did that. It looks like they followed the plans exactly. However, because these floors were never built historically, it is misleading in showing something that really never existed historically, but it appears to have existed historically and therefore does not meet the standards. Standard 4 says that changes to a property that have acquired historic significance in their own right will be retained and preserved. So if something is there, even if we don't necessarily like it, it is also historic. If it has lasted in the kind of federal guidelines, it's at least 50 years. So we need to reflect on all of a building's history, not just the period of when it was first built or the period whose style we like the most. Yes.
Can I just ask you, because this is tricky territory, I think.
Yeah.
Because I thought of that when you talked about restoration, and like you take it back to a certain point in time and you remove anything that's been added.
Yes.
But and I immediately popped in my head, well, what about these elements that have acquired their own significance?
Yeah. So
how I'm just interested in sort of your perspective on how do those balance?
Yeah. So I can tell you how the National Park Service, and therefore our office, deals with that question because it's an important one. In every National Register nomination or listing, it does state a period of significance. So it's really easy with a single individual building. Like a period of significance may be only a few years, it may be many years, but within the narrative, it can also, it can also highlight any specific dates of kind of extreme significance. And those are usually what are determined for restoration projects. When we run into applying the standards to a building in, for example, a historic district, where there's a period of significance applied to all of the buildings, then it becomes a matter of determining at what point was it most historic. For example, if it is, I'm trying to think of any good examples. So we ran into this on a project in Brigham City, where the building was built in the late 1800s, but then was remodeled at the storefront was remodeled within a decade or so. And then that storefront existed for 30 or 40 years before being replaced again. And because it looked like the second storefront for the majority of the period of significance, that's the time that the Park Service required us to take it back to, as opposed to the original 1890 facade, even though we had documentation of that facade. So the second storefront was determined to be more significant because it existed for more of the period of significance. This is one big difference between the standards for restoration and the standards for rehabilitation, where with restoration, you are identifying really, like, if you can, one date and saying it was most significant at that date. Whereas rehabilitation often looks at the whole history of the building and looks at kind of that larger period of significance.
I mean, it's like one of the situations where I've seen this is, say you have a Victorian commercial building that in the 50s had a 1950s commercial remodel on, you know, on the ground floor.
Yes.
And sometimes the tendency is that people want to go in and they say, well, we want to restore back to the Victorian. I have an actual 1950s, a real 1950s facade there that's been there for whatever, 60, 70 years or whatever. And I can tear that off and then create a fake Victorian.
Based off of images.
Based off some kind of images or some idea of what a Victorian commercial, ground floor commercial facade would look like. And
so,
I don't know, do the standards allow for choosing multiple periods of significance? Say there was significance 1898 when it was originally built, significant remodel in 1954, and those are both dates of significance.
Yes. So in that instance, the way I would interpret the standards and the way I would expect the Park Service to interpret it as well, based off of my experience working with them, is they would say you have an intact 1950s facade that has been there for at least as long as the original facade was, and therefore you should keep the 1950s facade. Especially because of the amount of conjecture and lack of the integrity is the term that's usually used, which means the historic materials themselves and whether they are existing or not. So that's the way we would apply the standards, would be you should keep the 1950s facade. So, yeah.
I think that's an interesting kind of balance.
Have you ever seen the Park Service say, choose whichever one you'd like?
So
I'm seriously interested.
So I'll continue with the example you gave of like the original Victorian, then the 1950s, and then oftentimes there will be like a 1990 or an early 2000s facade. And then you have, like, if they're about equal, like both of those would have existed for about 50-ish years, and are no longer extant, then you would need to make an argument as to which one you felt was more significant. Usually that's based on whether people, like, how people remember the character of the building. I've seen arguments based off of that. I've seen others based off of usually people will try to find significant events or significant people, either within, like, significant to the building itself or to the community, that they then base that judgment off of.
We had that come up a couple of months ago when the church came and wanted to make an alteration on the Beehive House, and they had laid out periods of significance, and that was very much at the core of sort of the issue there of, like, well, this change was made, but what period of significance? And they had multiple periods of significance, which made it a very complex question.
And it's often a complex
But that's what
question.
it was. It was all about period of significance.
Yes. And it is often a complex question, and often one that, for example, with our tax credit program, the federal tax credit program that requires the National Park Service to sign off on it, we will say, often when we're meeting with a property owner at the property, we'll say, here's what we believe, but before you do anything, we will check with the Park Service just to make sure, because that is an area, like a gray area, and lots of time it's up to you to sort through the different, like, reasons for significance that could be there and come up with a determination. Often it would be nice if there was always a right answer, but sometimes there isn't, and you just have to choose which one is either, like, slightly more significant or more feasible to construct. Yes.
Ask you a question. You made a comment about how people sometimes justify these things, and it was along the lines of how people remember it, right? Which is kind of interesting because depending on how old the building is, people aren't going to remember it how it was 120 years ago because they're not around. If it's been changed in the 50s versus today. And then using that argument, you essentially anchor that time period for the building for all coming time, more or less, don't you? Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So I will give you this example, and then it may or may not clarify things. And then we can continue to discuss. So this is a building in Ogden. It's the Altarest Mausoleum. And it was built, as you see on the right, in like 1974. Don't quote me on that date, but like right around then, is when they added this vestibule that's existing on the left. And the period of significance for this building is tied to a few years and encapsulates that addition. So if the property owner now wanted to go back and remove that, it would not meet the standards. So that is like one example where, regardless of like the change being like very out of character with the historic building being different, like a different style, it doesn't look really great, it would be required to be kept if it were to meet the standards due to the kind of narrowing of that period of significance.
So one additional question.
Yes.
I've been through the federal tax credit process, and it's an adventure to say the least. But so I'm familiar with the application of the standards in the context of being approved for the federal tax credits, and I imagine if the government owns a building, they'd probably comply to this too. Do these standards impact anything when the tax credits are not being considered?
So they are still like best practices.
Yeah.
But no, if, for example, when we meet with a property owner, if they don't want to meet the standards, then there's nothing federally that requires them to.
Yeah, okay.
That does come in at the local level.
Yeah.
Many jurisdictions throughout the nation base their local standards off of the national standards. And largely just because it's easier and so that there's consistency across like federal and local
So
And just on that note, we do base ours off the federal standards, not exactly word for word, but nearly,
Very closely.
very, very closely. But we also have a different program than SHPO, and we can sometimes be a little bit more flexible
so let me ask the question on this.
than the state.
As we get bogged down in various other things. When a property, and I'm just not familiar with the process, I guess, enough to know the answer to this already. When a structure or a building is designated a contributing property in a historic district and therefore falls under our jurisdiction, does it get assigned a period of significance in that process?
We have the periods of significance. We have those in our files.
Okay, so there is one assigned to each of those buildings. Okay.
That usually happens at the district level, though, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so not the individual buildings.
No, but in our new survey that we're updating, Central City, we're trying to do that, have the consultant actually put the building in a period of significance. Or a sub-period.
Any additional questions on this one? I know it's a...
We're only on 4. It's going to be a
Oh,
long...
yes. We have fun ones to come. So standard 5 states that distinctive materials, features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property will be preserved. In other words, the details matter. One of the issues that we come across often is people that have a historic building that has plaster want to remove that plaster to expose the brick. However, that plaster is a character-defining feature. It never would have existed without plaster previously because it would have been embarrassing and they would have looked cheap and like they couldn't afford to plaster their building. And therefore, if you remove it, it does not meet the standards. So like that at the detail level of the character defining features are important. Standard 6, so we're halfway there. Good job, everyone. Deteriorated historic features will be repaired rather than replaced. Where the severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature, the new feature will match the old in design, color, texture, and, where possible, materials. Replacement of missing features will be substantiated by documentary and physical evidence. So, in other words, if we can fix it, we should. This building takes an old factory warehouse and revamped it to, or rehabilitated it, to a commercial space. And in so doing, they removed the steel windows and replaced them with these really kind of awesome, gorgeous windows. However, like as objects, I think they're gorgeous. They do not meet the standards at all. If they were put in a new build construction, I would love them. That's all I'm saying. So because those materials could have been fixed or could have been replicated and they were not, it does not meet the standard.
Can I ask where that building is?
You can.
Okay, you don't know where it is?
And
Okay.
I have it in my notes. I don't have those notes here, I'm sorry. But I believe it's on the East Coast. I could be mistaken. Potentially Boston, but don't hold me to that. It is an Upper East Coast, I believe. So if you compare that project with this one, where they equally have steel windows, many of which had deteriorated to a point where they were no longer functional. Water and air were getting in and causing issues. However, instead of just replacing them wholesale, they first went through and inventoried each individual window to determine which ones could be were in good condition, which ones needed to be repaired, and which ones absolutely needed to be replaced. And then with the replacement windows, they worked with an aluminum window manufacturer to replicate the profiles, depths, and appearance of the window to the greatest extent possible. So you can see here on the left, those are muntins. They are the horizontal separations between panes of glass, and they took great lengths to replicate the form of those metal profiles as much as possible. You can also see that they did add different glazing on the replacement windows. So those are an insulated glazing unit. They're double glazed windows. And then on the right, this is cutting vertically through the window, and you can see that as much as possible, they replicated the size, the shape, and the appearance of the windows as much as they could. I will say that they gave preference to the exterior appearance as opposed to the interior appearance on this project. So much so that when you look at this wall, which has a mix of historic and replacement windows, they match almost exactly, and it's equally gorgeous in my opinion. So this does meet the standards for rehabilitation. Standard 7 states that chemical or physical treatments, if appropriate, will be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. Treatments that cause damage to historic materials will not be used. So we want to be kind to all of the historic materials. We see this often with masonry. So on the left, the brick had been painted, which is equally a chemical treatment that is not appropriate for historic masonry. And then to remove that, they sandblasted the brick. And you can see, if you look closely, that this brick is now pockmarked. And in sandblasting, they removed the hardened outer surface of the brick and left little fissures in that. And then over time, typically within 3 to 5 years, you will start to see pockmarks where water has gotten in, and then through freeze-thaw cycles or even just water getting in, it then causes the brick to start to spall. So that is one treatment that we don't recommend. Another one on masonry on the right is if you replace historic mortar with new mortar. I can go on a very long tangent about the history of Portland cement and how mortar now is much harder than it was historically. And what it does is if you use a new mortar that is not compatible with the historic brick, the mortar becomes the structural element of the wall as opposed to the brick. And so as the building expands and contracts, the brick is softer and will therefore start to be crushed and then fall away, leaving structural mortar, which should never be a phrase that you have to use. So we want to make sure that we're using chemical treatments that are appropriate. These do not meet the standards. Standard 8 is archaeological resources will be protected and preserved in place. If such resources must be disturbed, mitigation measures will be undertaken. Thankfully, this probably is not very applicable, but we do run across it often. We don't want to just don't touch archaeological resources if you can help it. On lots of the projects that we encounter, we tell people that if you find archaeological resources, contact one of the 3 people. So if they are artifacts, then like beer bottles, nails, et cetera, pottery, then you can contact Elizabeth Hora, the public archaeologist on staff in our office. If you find human remains, typically bones, you should first contact your local law enforcement. This is slightly crass, but usually if it's gooey, it's their problem. If it's not gooey, it's ours. And so we have a human remains program lead, Dorina Kopp, who will come out and remove all non-gooey human remains from your site and repatriate them as appropriate.
You guys would have a great time digging around in our front yard. We found
I'm
everything.
sure. Yeah, our state historic preservation officer is a historical archaeologist, so he focuses on artifacts not from prehistoric times, but from the comparatively recent past. And he loves coming with me and looking on site, and he can point out where like garbage piles were, and he geeks out very hard the way I geek out about old materials and old architecture. So it's fun. Another thing to note is that if you are receiving grant money, especially federal grant money, but also state, you should just contact SHPO if you find something. Standard 9, we're almost there, is new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction will not destroy historic materials, features, and spatial relationships that characterize the property. The new work will be differentiated from the old and will be compatible with the historic materials, features, size, scale and proportion, and massing to protect the integrity of the property and its environment. So this is twofold. First, we don't want to hurt the historic materials or proportion, all of those things. The second one is that we want anything we add to be a little bit different. We don't want it to be so compatible that it matches exactly and blurs the line of what is and is not historic. That's standard 3. So this is a very cute little bungalow in Australia, and they wanted to add on to the back. So here you can see the addition is in a very contemporary style. However, it is located on the kind of tertiary facade of the building, so it is not seen at all from the front. It also is much smaller in scale than the historic building, and it does kind of harken back to the historic in its use of materials and in the proportions. I especially love their use of wood and in metal siding that kind of mimics the historic siding, but in a very new and contemporary way. Another thing to note is the use of what in Utah I've heard it referred to as a hyphen. I always learned it as a gasket, which is a small portion of building that connects the addition with the historic. And so you have a much smaller portion of the building that actually touches the historic building. And this meets the standards. It is really lovely. This building does lots of things right. I especially love the use of materials here. So they use the same stone, but in a contemporary rain screen application as opposed to kind of the stacked stone masonry of the historic building. However, the location, the proportion, the massing, the the dominance of the addition over the historic building does not meet the standards. Finally, standard 10 is new additions and adjacent or related new construction will be undertaken in such a manner that, if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. In other words, we need to ask, are those things removable? If you add something, can it be removed if you ever want to pursue a restoration project? So this is a cool old theater in Armenia, and it is now a film school. And you can see the addition, and there are some things I appreciate about this. I can tell they took efforts to clearly distinguish the new from the old. They also took efforts to really locate as much massing as possible away from the historic building and facade. However, they also just sawed the building in half and then added the addition right adjacent to it. And therefore it is not removable and does not meet the standards. It also probably wouldn't meet standard 9 regardless, but in this case, standard 10, definitely not reversible and does not meet the standards. We can compare that with this project, where it's this small glassy enclosure that just joins two historic buildings. One is a carriage house, one is the main residence, and they wanted to be able to go from one to the other without getting cold and wet. And so this is really pretty beautiful in its transparency. It meets standard 9 in being smaller, but I appreciate in regards to standard 10 how they'd used only butt joints with the glazing, and so that means that they could, in theory, remove it relatively easily. If they did it like almost perfectly, they would align the like channel glass butt joints with mortar joints, and then it would be even easier to remove in the future and not damage as much brick. So, yes.
So the example that you gave in standard 9, that the building overbearing the historic building wouldn't comply with that, but would conceivably comply with this because you could remove that. And
yes. And that's one fun thing about the standards, is that they are very broad and are meant to apply to all buildings, and therefore you can meet some standards without meeting others. However, you really want, for preservation best practices, you want to meet all the standards, not just one or two. That's the goal. And this pleases Ron very much. So again, the final word, that the standards are tricky and there's lots of gray in there because they are broad and meant to be applied to all buildings of all different characters and materials and styles. And therefore, it is often difficult to know how exactly to apply the standards to a building. However, if you have any questions, I do have these resources. So this is a link to the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation. There's also, the National Park Service has a preservation by topic, which is kind of a whole collection of case law of how they have recommended this standards be applied to different buildings throughout time. And if you choose to go there, it is separated out by different building element, different building types, etc. And it can be a friendlier resource than just reading the standards over and over again. So any questions?
Are you hearing that the administration is going to uphold all of these rules and regulations?
So I am obviously not qualified to speak on part of the administration.
Job cuts?
So I can speak to what has happened currently. Currently, the National Park Service is still in existence. They are still reviewing tax credit and grant projects, and have continued to apply the standards the way they have in previous years that I've worked with them.
Thank you.
They have also, as far as I'm aware, I have not heard of them seeking to change the standards at all. So they, as far as I'm aware, these should be good for at least
another day.
A few days. Yes, things can change, but
has there been any kind of movement to alter the standards in any substantial way?
No, and as far as I'm aware, they haven't altered significantly since the 60s.
It seems like they've been
fairly
pretty
consistent
stable
over lots of time.
But they don't necessarily line up completely with international standards.
No. So, for example, the case study I gave for Standard 9, the theaters that are now a film school, those do meet the standards in Armenia and UNESCO standards for that period of building in Armenia. And lots of it is one of the key differences between Europe and American standards is that Europe is looking at millennia of history, whereas we're looking at centuries of built environment history that we're trying to maintain. for the most part. There are other, there are some Native American dwellings, like in New Mexico, where they were permanent, and those do exist and have existed for millennia, but the majority of projects we run into are not archaeological and more historic.
Out of curiosity,
Yes.
and you may not be able to answer this, but U.S. standards versus, for example, French standards or whatever is common in Western Europe. For the most part, there might be differences, but are they relatively consistent, or are there certain areas where there's a significant difference in how they approach something versus how the National Park Service would approach something?
Painting in very broad strokes, they are generally consistent. Sometimes there is more a slight difference in the way they conceive compatibility, where some people would consider very contemporary element applied on a very old building to be incompatible. Sometimes I've seen more leniency in European standards versus American. Again, part of that is the age of the buildings being, 500 plus years old. And so, but generally consistent, I will say. Any additional questions?
All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Thank you. And we consult SHPO all the time, our friends at SHPO, who are friends yet experts. So thank you very much for your presentation tonight. It was so great.
And with that, we will formally adjourn.
Thank you.
Look where you're going. Use strategic lane positioning to help you see and avoid roadway hazards and to maintain a safe distance from other traffic.